This is our interview about Ronald Reagan. What do you remember about the election of President Ronald Reagan?
Well, I don't remember very much, but I remember more the events before the election. The Iranian hostage crisis happened a little bit before their election while Jimmy Carter was president, and I remember a lot about that being on the TV.
Did you vote in the election, and what would intrigue you to vote in that election?
I was only 12 at the time of the election, so I did not get to vote.
Did you vote for Ronald Reagan or Jimmy Carter?
Well, I didn't vote, but I would have voted for Ronald Reagan.
What were some of the major events that you remember? How do you think Ronald Reagan handled them?
The first thing I remember is just 69 days into his presidency, Ronald Reagan got shot. And I remember that being on the news, and I remember him going into the hospital. And I remember it was the first time ever that the Secretary of State actually was controlling the country while President Reagan was in the hospital and Vice President Ford was actually out of the country and coming back. So I remember that. And then I also remember all of the Reaganomics, which was his plan for implementing supply side economics, and there was a lot of talk about that, and it was very controversial.
Thinking about American culture of the time, what was the music, movies, and TVs like?
Well, it was the 80s, so there was punk music. People wore parachute pants. It was the time of the hair bands, so there were a lot of rock and roll bands that had the guys had really, really long hair, wore girls' makeup. It was, Motley Crue and Poison and Rat. So the bands were kind of funky. I remember Star Trek on TV and the Bionic Man, the $10 Million Man was a good show. As far as what did kids do for fun, I would say that it was not that much different than today. There was sports and dancing and that kind of thing. We didn't have, not everybody didn't have a cell phone back then. That's probably the biggest thing. So if you talked on the phone, you had to talk on the house phone.
Did you personally, did you personally do during that time period?
I had parachute pants and I listened to some of the hair bands. I never got into punk music, and I didn't let my hair grow into a mullet, but that was pretty popular at the time too.
By the end of Reagan's term, had you changed your mind about how you felt about Reagan? Would you have voted for him if you could?
I didn't change my mind about him. I always liked him as a president. If I could have voted, I would have voted for him again. I think that for the 8 years that he was president, I think the country had a lot of jobs and was prosperous. So.
It has been disputed that it was Mikhail Gorbachev that brought the Cold War to an end, and not Reagan. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think it takes both sides to come to an agreement to end the Cold War. So I think both men deserve credit for ending the Cold War. Certainly, Reagan showed a lot of strength and resolve, and I think that helped in that Gorbachev knew he couldn't just push people around. The Russian government was having some trouble economically, and I think Reagan showed a willingness to come to the table and compromise, and so I think that was probably equally beneficial for both countries to end the Cold War.
I agree. I think that it takes two people to end a war, just like it takes two people to start a war.
Mm-hmm.
The economic program used by Reagan as president emphasized low taxes, decreased economic regulation, low social services spending, and high military spending. Do you think this economic plan actually helped the economy?
I do. They initially, the person who ended up becoming his vice president and later our president called it voodoo economics. I remember that. But he did prove that it is an effective way to approach the economics of a country. If you look at inflation, it was kept low during his presidency, where prior to his presidency, inflation had been running very, very high as they were trying to spin their way into economic growth. If you look at the gross domestic product per worker, it increased to 1.8% during his presidency from 0.8%, and the federal spending fell to 2.5% from 4%, the deficit. So I think he was able to effectively lower deficit spending and increase the output of the country with his economics.
In your opinion, what do you think was the best thing that Reagan did for our country while serving as president?
I think one of the things that he did that was probably the best lasting thing is his supply side economics. I think it lowered the government spending. He deregulated a lot of industries like the airline industry. So he pushed for smaller government, lower taxes, incentivize companies to grow and create jobs. And I think that's become what most of the Republican Party now stands for. Prior to Reagan and his supply side economics, I don't think the Republican Party was quite as staunch in those positions, and now I think his proof that is an effective way to run the economics has now changed the party.
Do you think our country would be better off now with Reagan as our president rather than Obama?
Yes, because I think he would again look to have a smaller government, and he would look to incentivize companies to grow versus now we continue to have the government grow, and the government try to invest in order to generate growth in the country, and it's just burdens the payers as opposed to incentivizing the companies to actually grow and generate economic growth.
Because if the companies don't have incentive to grow because they just keep getting bailed out.
Yes, and it starts to weaken our competitive position versus other countries, such as China starting to grow, Pacific Rim. A lot of the European countries are having problems, but we rely upon our companies to be competitive in a global marketplace, and you can't have the government support them and have it be competitive in a global marketplace. That's exactly what Russia had trouble with, is that they could not compete, which that bad economic times is what eventually drove Gorbachev to reach out and try to end the Cold War.
Well, thank you so much for answering those questions and better understanding my learning of President Ronald Reagan.